Everyone wants the Emirates NBA Cup.
And things are heating up.
30 teams started.
Bang!
But only 8 have advanced to the single elimination knockout rounds. To survive, they'll have to be hungry, relentless, ruthless.
Are you kidding me?
They all want the cup, but only one team can claim it. Who will capture the cup? Emirates NBA Cup semifinals, Saturday on Prime.
Starting your business isn't just about opening the doors. It's keeping the dream you built secure. With New York Life, you get the financial guidance to make it real. Start today at nyl.com.
This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by Cornell University Press. In episode 109, we explored the life and ideas of Cadwallader Colden. And during our conversation with John Dixon, we discussed Colden's book, The History of the Five Indian Nations, which was one of the most important intellectual works published in and about 18th century British America. In History of the Five Indian Nations, Colden explores the history, customs, and forms of government used and practiced by the peoples of the Iroquois Confederacy. Of course, as much as the book tells us about the Haudenosaunee peoples who lived in the early to mid-18th century, it tells us even more about early modern European and Euro-American culture. In 1958, Cornell University Press reprinted History of the Five Indian Nations, and since that time, the book has served as an invaluable resource for scholars and students interested in a whole variety of topics, such as Iroquois history and culture, Enlightenment attitudes towards Native Americans, early American intellectual life, and Anglo-French imperial contests over North America. This year, in 2017, Cornell is publishing a new critical edition of Colden's book. This new edition features essays by John Dixon and Karim Tiro that place Colden's work in historical and cultural context. Of this new edition, Library Journal notes, no collection pretending an interest in Indian or colonial affairs should be without this contemporary account. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell to learn more about this newest edition of this historical classic.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 122 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. George Washington won the war for American independence. Or wait, no, perhaps that phrase should really be, British General Henry Clinton lost the American war by not reinforcing Cornwallis at Yorktown. Of course, is it really fair to blame poor Henry Clinton? Perhaps we should be looking at John Burgoyne, whose defeat at Saratoga caused the French to join the war on the Americans' behalf. As you know and can tell, the American War for Independence was complicated. Historical sources provide us with lots of information about the war and how British and American politicians, civilians, and soldiers conducted and participated in the war effort, which is why there's lots of history books about the event. And when you read those history books, you've probably noticed that there are a lot of different reasons and perspectives on why Americans won the war or why the British lost it. In fact, even just looking at the war in terms of American victory or British defeat provides us with different viewpoints on the event. Did the Americans win the war, or did the British simply just lose it? If only we had an expert to help us assess the merits of these viewpoints. Of course, we do have an expert because this is Ben Franklin's World. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, author of The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, joins us today to help us explore the American War for Independence from a British perspective. During our investigation, Andrew will take us through how the British government operated during the mid to late 18th century, officers in the British government like King George III and their roles in the American crisis, and the various parts played in the war by commanding officers in the British Army and Navy. This is going to be an awesome exploration. Are you ready for it? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He's an award-winning historian who specializes in the history of the British Empire and the Atlantic world, and he's the author of 2 books, An Empire Divided, The American Revolution in the British Caribbean, and, most recently, The Men Who Lost America, British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of the Empire, which won many awards, including the 2014 George Washington Book Prize. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrew O'Shaughnessy.
Thank you very much, Liz. I appreciate being invited.
In The Men Who Lost America, Andrew notes that history has this idea that British leadership of the American War for Independence was incompetent and that American victory was inevitable. And he also notes that it was this perception that caused him to write his book, because he wants to change it. Andrew, would you tell us how history has come to see British leadership of the war as incompetent and Americans as destined to win it?
Well, this idea was one that really was initiated by the British themselves. During the actual war, the politicians and military leaders were blaming each other. The military leaders also blamed one another. And so it became, in fact, a standard view that the war was largely lost by poor leadership. In the 1790s, when the first British consul came to America, he met George Washington and he said he looked a very impressive man, but he would have looked less impressive if we'd sent good military leaders against him. It's an odd idea and certainly really not one that's in the interest of Americans, because it gives the impression that the war was simply lost by British bungling rather than American competence.
I can tell this is going to be a fascinating conversation. But before we explore who the men who lost America were and how they came to be viewed as incompetent, I think it would be really helpful for us to know how the British government worked during the mid to late 18th century. Would you give us an overview of how Parliament functioned and how government divided the powers between Lord North, who served as Prime Minister for most of the war, and King George III?
Well, the British system's always harder to understand than the American because they don't have a written constitution, and the system has changed over time, even though the names and parts of government remain the same. So this is a period when the monarchy and the king are still very important. George III played a major role in government. It was George III who chose the prime ministers, but he had to choose someone who was acceptable to the majority in Parliament. So it was always a delicate balancing act, finding an individual who was both acceptable to the king and acceptable to the majority of people in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister didn't even choose all the members of the cabinet. Some of those were appointed by George III. George III was head of the military, much like the President of the United States. So this is a period in which monarchy still has a lot of power. But what changed when Britain had a revolution of its own in 1688 was that the monarchy was held accountable by Parliament. Parliament had to be called every year to vote for supplies for the military and to vote taxes. And Parliament was really largely responsible for policy making. Even though the king was often involved in decisions with the cabinet, most of the major decisions, like the policies like the Stamp Act and the measures that led to the American Revolution, most of those decisions were made by the Prime Minister and by Parliament.
Now, in The Men Who Lost America, Andrew explores the British defeat in America by investigating the lives of 10 men who Britons blame for losing the 13 North American colonies. Andrew, Alec would like to know how you chose the 10 men you wrote about in your book, and why you didn't choose to write about other men like Thomas Gage.
Well, I wanted to have a balance between political leaders and military, because an important theme of the book is that military decisions are not made in a vacuum. The senior army and naval commanders were answerable to the government. They had a lot of political pressure put upon them. The government played a major role in the decisions that led to the outbreak of the war and the political miscalculation. So I wanted to maintain that balance. I did not choose Thomas Gage, who Alec specifically mentioned. He would certainly have been very legitimate for inclusion. So would Sir Guy Carleton, the British commander in Canada. But I didn't want the book to be too long, and I really wanted to start out with the war itself. So Lexington and Concord, where Gage was commanding, those were regarded essentially as skirmishes. The first real battle was Bunker Hill. And although Gage was still the commander at Bunker Hill, the effective strategy was that of Sir William Howe and the 3 British generals who Britain had sent out because they decided that Gage simply lacked the capacity to command during the American War. I would say that I chose the biographical approach partly to make it engaging to the general reader. I particularly like the idea of short biographies because that makes it possible really to get at the essence of an individual, especially when you're looking at them in a period of crisis and how they respond. I was always a great admirer of Richard Hofstadter as the American political tradition, where he went through largely former presidents of the United States and gave these very distinctive cameo portraits of each of them. The book is set up a bit like a play. Each character is introduced at the moment that they become most important to the story, but it's written too along a timeline so that the cumulative effects of reading about these individuals is not only to tell the story of the British side of the American Revolution, but to understand why it was in the end that they failed.
With that prologue in place, let's explore some of the viewpoints and actions of the men in your book. Now, The Men Who Lost America starts with King George III. So why don't we start with him? Andrew, would you tell us about King George III and his role in the American War for Independence?
Well, of course, George III famously was blamed as a tyrant by the Declaration of Independence. It's quite amusing that in his 80s, John Adams, who'd been ambassador to London and had actually met George III, this is John Adams, the second president, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said, "You were wrong to call George III a tyrant." And certainly my chapter on George III would agree that George III was not really responsible for the policies that led to the American Revolution, but in some ways people can retain him as a villain because he becomes the leading war hawk after the Boston Tea Party. He becomes quite obsessed with the subject of America, so much so that he twice wrote out his abdication and thought about stepping down in his role as king rather than accept the British loss of America.
I imagine you must have some pretty unique insights when it comes to King George III, because as I researched your biography, I found that you're involved with that new Georgian Papers program, which is a program that is working to catalog and digitize not only the papers of King George III, but of other members of the Hanoverian household. Would you tell us about this program and about your involvement with it?
This is very exciting because the royal family did not retain their own papers and archives until really the 19th century. And George III's papers were given to the Duke of Wellington and his family, Wellington, who'd won the great victory at the Battle of Waterloo. They were given by George III's son, and it was not until the early 20th century that the papers were given back to the royal family, and they're now stored at Windsor Castle. The problem has been that they've not been very accessible. The archive office was only open for a few days each week and for very short hours. There was not enough space for more than just a handful of researchers. And so the current royal librarian, Oliver Urquhart Irvine, is digitizing the papers in association with King's College, London University, and the website will go up in January, and it'll be possible for anyone anywhere in the world to read the papers of George III. They won't all go up immediately. This is a process that's going to go on for 4 or 5 years, but it'll be a major bonus to historians because only about 15% of them have been published.
Have you had a chance to look at any of King George III's papers? I mean, what will we find in this collection?
Yes, I just spent the last month at Windsor Castle, which was rather exciting. I got to walk up 104 stone steps each day with a cannon facing me and to work in the Round Tower, which is the largest building in what is still the largest residential castle in the world. And I went through the papers and had a number of exciting finds. One of the sets of documents that's not been published was the reports of a personal spy of George III who was simply called Aristarchus. And these reports include reports on Benjamin Franklin's activities in France. And one of the reports he sent was that Emperor Joseph II would be visiting Paris from Austria and that Franklin was going to have an agent climb into the chimney in order that he could overhear the diplomatic conversations that would be taking place. Probably the most exciting papers for a military historian are the private papers of Sir Samuel Hood, the admiral who was deputy in command of the most important naval battle of the Revolution, the Chesapeake Capes. Those papers have never been published, and they've never even been used by any of Hood's biographers, so those were a real find. It was unexpected that they would be at Windsor and that Hood had been privately, essentially corresponding through the ADC of George III, basically with the king and giving him a back channel of information about the war.
I know you were only there for about a month, but did you get a feel for how access to the Georgian papers through the new Georgian Papers program might change how we view the American Revolution and King George III?
I would not change the conclusions of my own work based on the papers, but what it will do is certainly flesh out a lot of details. There are very important maps and plans that have not been used by scholars, sketches done by military engineers during the war. And I think as important as the information it gives us on social and economic history, there's no more detailed information anywhere on British tradesmen in that period than in the correspondence with all of the retailers that were used by the royal family. And my book does look very much at a British perspective, and that has tended not to be done in the historiography of the Revolution. And we have far fewer books on the British side of the Revolution than we do, say, on the Confederacy during the Civil War. And so I think even what has been published of George III's papers would give people a very different impression and probably a more sympathetic understanding of George III.
Let's move on to Frederick Lord North, who served as British Prime Minister for most of the War for Independence. During the 1760s and 1770s, North really favored taxing the American colonies, and he favored strong coercive measures when Americans protested those taxes, as he did in 1765 and 1773. Yet North seems to be a bit of a contradictory figure, because after the Boston Tea Party, he pressed for coercive measures against Boston and for troops to subdue Massachusetts and New England. Then, in 1778, he created and dispatched the Carlisle Peace Commission to explore making peace with the United States. Andrew, as North's position towards America changed over time, would you tell us about Lord North and how and why his views on America changed during the war?
Well, Lord North today is known as the worst Prime Minister in British history because he presided over the loss of America. It's really very unfair, and he was a brilliant parliamentarian. He was one of the greatest speakers in Parliament, of any time period. He was facing one of the toughest political oppositions of any war, with people like Edmund Burke, father of modern conservatism, Charles James Fox, William Pitt, both the elder and the younger. He was also really doing two modern-day jobs. He was running the budget as well. He was, in fact, a very flexible person who originally did not see that the tea duty would be so explosive. He never imposed a new tax on America. In fact, he removed many of the policies of his predecessors. When he became Prime Minister, the day that he became Prime Minister was the day of the Boston Massacre. And the first 3 years of his premiership are often known by historians as the years of quiet. It, in fact, looked as though it was more likely Britain would be fighting a war with Spain than fighting a war in America. And it was the Tea Act, which was not a new duty on tea. It actually reduced the tea duty, which led to the American Revolution. It caused the Boston Tea Party, and the British then reacted to the Boston Tea Party by trying to cut off New England with the so-called Intolerable Acts. And Lord North very quickly realized that it would be impossible to isolate Boston, that the other 12 colonies would support Massachusetts. And so he immediately began to backtrack when he heard about news of the meeting of the First Continental Congress, which had met in September 1774. News didn't arrive in England until December as to exactly what they discussed, but that convinced him that the colonies would unite. And he immediately tried to make a peace offer, known as Lord North's Conciliatory Proposal, in February of 1775. And throughout the war, he tried to negotiate through third parties. The best offer he made was at the height of the war in 1778, known as the Carlisle Peace Commission, in which basically he offered America much of what had been demanded before 1776. He offered to repeal all the taxes with a promise never to tax America again. He offered to recognize Congress and he was merely seeking token British authority by the middle of the war. He felt so strongly about this that he kept trying to resign, and George III put moral pressure on him to remain in his place and essentially tried to deflect him from that. But he eventually regarded himself as an obstacle to any negotiations with America and really wanted to resign from the government.
It seems like it must have been a really odd dynamic between Lord North and King George III, as Lord North was becoming more conciliatory towards the colonies and King George III more hawkish.
That's right. But George III had to keep Lord North because all of the other major political leaders of other factions, they didn't really have true parties in this period, all of them were committed to the idea of some kind of acceptance of American independence by about the middle of the war, and certainly the withdrawal of troops. And even at the beginning of the war, they'd been against using the military to coerce America. So he had to rely on Lord North. Lord North, for his part, felt very beholding on a personal level to George III. The two of them had known each other in childhood. Their parents were friends, and George III had helped Lord North with his debts and had also given him a number of great honours. And George III was threatening to abdicate and create a virtual constitutional crisis as the war neared an end, which must have also affected North.
Before we move into Act 2 of our conversation, the part that explores Great Britain's military leaders, let's explore one more political leader, George Germain, the Secretary of State for America. Andrew, would you tell us about Germain and about his role during the American crisis and war? Also, what exactly were the responsibilities for the Secretary of State for America?
Well, Lord George Germain was Secretary of State for the American colonies, or an American department was another name for his position. And he was the person in England most responsible for the war in America. He was its chief architect. And he's the civilian politician who was most blamed for Britain's failure in America.
Okay, let's move on to Act 2. In The Men Who Lost America, Andrew points out that King George III and his cabinet actually handpicked the 4 commanders they dispatched to America, and they handpicked these commanders for their extensive military expertise and experience. Andrew, let's start with the Howe brothers. Would you tell us who they were and about the roles they played in the American War for Independence?
Sir William Howe was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. He was appointed shortly after the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he remained Commander-in-Chief until the middle of the war, and he was chosen over 105 more senior generals. He was one of the most junior generals of the British Army. And there's often an impression that the people who led the British Army and British government were just aristocratic buffoons. There was no real competition. But in actual fact, Howe was appointed very much on the basis of his ability. He'd served in America during the French and Indian War. He was at the side of General Wolfe when he was killed at the Battle for Quebec, and he then helped lead what's still regarded as one of the greatest British victories of all time, in which the British captured Quebec and with it Canada. He was an expert in light infantry, and light infantry were regarded as the best troops for dealing with the kind of guerrilla warfare that the British indeed had anticipated right at the beginning of the war. Light infantry are a bit like commando soldiers. They're expected to move very quickly, and they didn't keep to rank and file and just march in lines. They could hide behind trees and be extremely flexible. His brother, Lord Richard Howe, was actually older, and he commanded the Navy over the same period as his brother. He took over the command of the Navy a few months after his brother became commander of the Army. He was chosen because of his brother. His brother insisted that if he command the army, his older brother must command the Navy. And this was extremely smart because there was no joint chief of staff at this time. The Army and Navy was completely separately administered. Lord George Germain was responsible for the war, but he had almost no control over the Navy. And as a result of these two brothers, the logistical coordination between the Army and Navy was really very close, and they managed to land 15,000 men and 40 cannon within 3 or 4 hours on a beach in Staten Island in late August of 1776. They were able to do amphibious operations anywhere. And Lord Richard Howe was really one of the leading British naval thinkers on how to do amphibious warfare. That is, when the Army and the Navy combine to make landings with troops much like those at D-Day. And he, incidentally, became one of Britain's leading naval heroes after the American Revolution for a battle known as the Glorious 1st of June, fought against France. And he's a very good example of how there's an extremely thin line between success and failure. You know that if conditions are not right, even for the best people, they may automatically fail. And there are some analogies between my book and a book that was written about the Vietnam War called The Best and the Brightest, that it can't just be explained by lack of ability. Most of these personalities in this book are people of real substance who would be well remembered today but for their involvement in this fateful event.
One of the many interesting aspects of your book is that Richard and William Howe really were able to coordinate their land and naval operations. And I wonder if this coordination was because they were brothers or due to some other factor. I mean, why weren't other general-admiral combinations able to coordinate to the same level as the Howe brothers?
They were extremely close. And so, yes, the answer to your question is it was much easier because they were brothers. It sounds like classic nepotism. And the government did not want to appoint the brother to be admiral. It was only that Sir William Howe absolutely insisted if he was to command the army, Lord Richard Howe must command the navy. And it actually worked very well.
History books often criticize the Howe brothers because they held conciliatory views towards the Americans. And these weren't covert, I'm keeping them to myself conciliatory views. These were views that they had aired during their service in Parliament. Did the Howe brothers' conciliatory views ever affect their command of the British war effort?
This is the irony that most of the military leaders were much less hawkish than the civilian leaders. So Sir William Howe was a member of Parliament, and he'd actually promised his constituents that he would never serve in America because he was against the war. And Lord Richard Howe, if anything, was even more conciliatory. He came over to America with a desire to negotiate a peace. He even had ships in his fleet with names like Friendship, which was a sort of symbolic. He really wanted to play the role of Dove. You know, the big question about Sir William Howe is why was he not much more aggressive early in the war, especially when he had Washington almost in his grips in New York. I'm not sure, though, that their desire for peace and their willingness to negotiate really explains why he was not more aggressive. I think part of the reason for that was his experience of the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which more British officers were lost proportionally than in almost any British battle, and which had been a bloodbath. And he realized he couldn't afford to lose troops in those numbers. And Sir William Howe also, I think, believed that the revolution would implode if he just kept the pressure up. No, he wasn't entirely convinced that a victory would be enough, because a victory would simply lead to a kind of military state. You know, he understood the psychological element that in many ways you needed a willing citizenry. The last thing that the British wanted was another Ireland. Britain had to garrison Ireland with about a third of its army during peacetime, and they could never have afforded to keep a massive army in America.
Let's move on to another British general, John Burgoyne. In 1776, John Burgoyne went to England and advocated for a command that would allow him to have enough men to orchestrate a three-pronged approach to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. England granted him his wish, but he fell short of his goal when he lost at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. Andrew, would you give us your take on John Burgoyne? Was he really responsible for the British loss at Saratoga?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because that campaign always seems the perfect example if you wanted to make the case that these leaders were utterly incompetent. And, you know, even the university textbooks would have arrows showing what was meant to be a three-pronged campaign and attack on the Continental Army in New England from three different armies, which should have all met up at Albany. The plan, in fact, was much looser than that. And there's always been the belief that Lord George Germain simply failed to coordinate the two armies, Burgoyne's army coming down from Canada and Sir William Howe's army that should have gone up from New York to meet him in Albany, and that was the reason. Others have blamed Burgoyne's brigado in believing he could simply attain his target without a larger army and without support. And others have blamed Sir William Howe for marching down to Philadelphia. In reality, Germain was much more worried about Howe in Philadelphia than he was about Burgoyne marching down from Canada. And the idea that the two armies should meet had always been a very loose plan and not one that was regarded as essential to the success of either army. It had been the plan the previous year where Sir William Howe had not met up with Sir Guy Carleton and had made no effort, in fact, even though Carleton never got further than the Lake Champlain. He had made no effort to try to march up in support of Carleton, and nobody blamed him for that in 1776. There was no plan B once they'd met up at Albany. The plan was really a reduction of all of the American colonies, and both generals had believed that they could achieve their objectives, Burgoyne in New York and Howe in Pennsylvania, without additional military support. The real miscalculation of the Battle of Saratoga and the events that led up to it, the turning point of the war, the real miscalculation was the belief of both generals that they were going to receive massive support from the local population. They believed the majority of Americans supported Britain. Burgoyne thought that once he took Fort Ticonderoga, it would be plain sailing to Albany. He regarded Ticonderoga as the really tough objective. And Sir William Howe thought that much of Pennsylvania was loyalist.
Yeah, this was a point you brought up in your chapter on George Germain, too, that there were many people in government who thought that there was just this widespread loyalist support for the British cause. Did this type of loyalist support just never exist in America? Or is there some other reason that loyalists just never turned out in the large numbers that the British government expected?
This was the major British miscalculation, but it's very defensible given the information they had available to them. It's always important to remember that the American Revolutionary War was also a civil war. 19,000 Americans fought for the British. A huge number of exiles, 60,000 white Americans, along with some 10,000 African Americans, went into exile during and after the Revolution, which is a much higher proportion of the population than left France during the bloodier French Revolution. And an estimated 1/5 of the American population supported Britain. But ultimately, the British got it wrong. The reason that they thought there was much support is that was what loyalist Americans were telling them. People like Joseph Galloway, who was one of Pennsylvania's leading politicians in the Continental Congress of 1775. He would probably have been a national politician whose name would be remembered had he sided with the Americans. He was saying weeks before the Battle of Yorktown that 4/5 of the American population supported Britain. And it's an easy error because even today, with scientific polling, we can get results, as we saw in the last election, very wrong. And it's even more difficult during wartime. And there are lots of recent examples of this where even in the West, with the best modern ways to try to calculate opinion, that we often are really unsure of what is happening on the ground. And that's because in wartime especially, opinion is often wavering and changing. A very high proportion of the American population were basically neutral, whatever that meant. They didn't serve in the war. They didn't show obvious leadings in either direction. And so in many ways, the British hoped to win the support of what today we would call the silent majority.
Were there any British leaders on the ground in America that recognized, hey, London's projecting these huge loyalist numbers and they're never going to materialize? And if they did recognize this fact, did they ever try to convince and prove to London that they were wrong?
Well, there was one, and that was Sir Henry Clinton, who was Commander-in-Chief for the second half of the war. He's possibly one of the most underestimated of all of the personalities in this book. He's one of the least known, even though he was Commander-in-Chief for the second half of the war. And he always had doubts as to whether there was real support for Britain. And he understood that support was going to be crucial to the outcome. He understood that this was a war very different from all other wars, and that the views of the citizenry were going to be a key to the outcome. In fact, he basically used the term winning hearts and minds. He said we need to win the hearts and subdue the minds of America. And he was also very insightful in seeing the importance of the Navy to the outcome of this war. His father had been an admiral, his uncle was an admiral, and he warned the British government from the time he took command in the middle of the war and replaced Sir William Howe. He warned the British government that they would lose this war any time that there was a superior French fleet at sea that could cut off a detachment of the British Army, which is basically what happened at the Battle of Yorktown. He was in a very difficult position because he had less troops and less naval support than Britain had given to the Howe brothers, because Britain was beginning to focus most of its energy on a world war with France and Spain. And so he was expected to win this war with fewer resources at a time when Britain was fighting a world war, first with France, then Spain, and then with the Dutch.
You know, Henry Clinton is really an interesting person to consider here, because of all the generals, he's the only one who grew up in America. Andrew, do you think Clinton's firsthand experience with America played any role in his knowledge about American loyalists or in the way he commanded the British war effort?
Well, actually, both commanders-in-chief had American experience. Sir William Howe had served in America during the French and Indian War, although he was primarily in Canada, but he was very familiar with colonial militia and with the continent. Clinton had grown up in America, in New York, and his family even owned land in America because his father had been governor of New York. So that did give him some familiarity with the country, and he undoubtedly had a much better grasp of the critical issues in this war than really any of the other British commanders. He was actually the most cerebral of the British military. We know that he was the best read officer on military affairs of any officer during the 18th century in Britain. We have some 40 volumes of his notes that he'd taken from history books and books on strategy and books on geography that show him to have been extremely well prepared and to be very thoughtful.
Before we move into the time warp, let's conclude our second act here. We opened our conversation with a discussion of how we came to view British leadership of the American War for Independence as incompetent. Andrew, why do you think it's important that we recognize that the men who, quote, lost America were really men of intelligence and superior military and governmental experience? I mean, how does this understanding change and shape what we know about the American Revolution?
It's really very important because I think the blaming of leadership, which is always a very natural thing to do, and we do it all the time, hold individuals accountable, when sometimes the situation would virtually not allow for success. And so I think it's a problem to put so much emphasis on leadership, and you see it especially in the movies, where these personalities are parodied, like the film The Patriot, which shows Lord Cornwallis as more worried about his uniform and his dogs than winning the war. And that is a typical portrait of almost any movie on the Revolution. You get it even in popular history. Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly, a third of it was devoted to the British during the American Revolution. The problem with that view is it distracts from the real essence of this war and why it was lost. And briefly, I think one of the major keys was popular support that would be very critical and that the British lacked. They had never expected that they would need to occupy America. They had an army of conquest, not an army of occupation. They were able to conquer every American city at some point during the war, but they were never able really to occupy territory like in New Jersey over the winter of 1776-77. The best example is in the South. Clinton took Charleston, the largest city in the South, in South Carolina. Even he suddenly became more optimistic about the possibilities of winning the war despite lack of public support. A few weeks later, Cornwallis took much of the Continental Army in the South, and the South, it is seemed, was largely under British control, but that's when they started to face militia and face what they called partisan bands led by people like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter. Although there were dozens of these leaders in the South, those were just two of the most successful who cut their supply lines and kept them constantly on the offensive.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the British government had raised and staffed an army of occupation instead of a conquering army at the start of 1775? How would the American War for Independence have been different?
Well, it is possible that with a massive army and a very aggressive leader at the start of the war, it is possible that if they had defeated and captured Washington and the Continental Army, that there might have been a negotiated peace. We do know from the Civil War that once the Confederate Army had been truly defeated, there was no attempt to then carry on fighting using guerrilla tactics. And that in many ways would have been very undesirable because it would have led to a lot of fragmentation and possibly social chaos. So it is possible that they would have made terms. I remember I once gave a talk at a retirement home and someone asked me, so what would America been like if the British had retained it? And I said, well, it would probably be like Canada, because if you want to think what America would be if British control had continued, you really only need to look north of the border. They have the largest changing of the guard of redcoats in Ontario. They still have the Queen on their currency. But obviously, they've managed to become a democracy and to become independent without fighting a revolution. So there are lots of consequences, like, for example, the extreme anti-government feeling that you have in America that you do not have in Canada.
Your first book explored the revolution in the Caribbean. Your second, of course, British leadership during the War for American Independence. What is the topic of your third book?
So it's actually going to be something totally different. It's going to be about Thomas Jefferson's founding of the University of Virginia. You mentioned at the beginning of your show that I work at Monticello. I'm also a professor at the University of Virginia. One of Jefferson, what he regarded as one of his three greatest achievements in life, the first two were the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which became the model for the separation of church and state in America. The third, though, was his establishment of the University of Virginia. And I'm going to call it the illimitable freedom of the human mind, which was Jefferson's own phrase. I'm particularly interested in it because our education now is in a state of crisis, especially public education and the problem of public funding, and also what role universities should be playing. And here you have one of America's founders with an incredible vision, really, for what a university could and should be. He managed every aspect of it, including designing buildings and the layout. He was intimately involved with the construction, even getting some of his own craftsmen employed to build it. He oversaw the library and the curriculum. It was a very remarkable achievement, but it was only the tip of the iceberg. He'd wanted to introduce public education in Virginia for both boys and girls from the primary school level, which would have made America really, and certainly Virginia, the first place anywhere to have a fully funded public school system. And he wanted the university to be free, even though it was likely that most of those who attended would be planters who certainly had the resources to be able to pay for a private education. But it was all part of his view and that of most of the founders that education was essential for a republic and that in order to have a representative system of government, you had to have an educated citizenry.
And if we still have questions about the men who supposedly lost America, what's the best way to contact you?
So you can look at it on the Monticello website in our research section. That's monticello.org, and that's always worth looking at it anyway because we've got lots of historical material there. I've got a Wikipedia entry. There are videos of my giving talks for C-SPAN and also YouTube, and you can find my email details through the University of Virginia. I have a Vita posted on their website, and that has my email address at Monticello.
Andrew O'Shaughnessy, thank you for helping us explore some British perspectives on the American War for Independence.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
The men who lost America were smart, capable, and able leaders. And as Andrew noted, this is a big reason why we shouldn't view the War for Independence in terms of a British loss. Because doing so really takes away from the Americans' victory. I mean, let's be honest. George Washington's command and strategy really do look more impressive when situated within the context of American victory. With that said, as Andrew also reminded us, we can't look at the American victory in the War for Independence as inevitable. The historical sources we have tell a really different story. A story that shows us that the Americans almost lost big victories like Saratoga. If more loyalists had turned out, if New Englanders and New Yorkers had continued to squabble over supply contracts, if arms from France had not arrived, the war could have ended differently. We need to remember to look at and explore the past with contingency in our minds. We know the outcome of historic events because those events have already happened. But the people who lived through past events didn't experience those events as history. They experienced them as the unknowable and uncertain present, just like we're experiencing our present today. For more information about Andrew, his book, The Men Who Lost America, plus notes from today's episode, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/122. Okay, I have some really exciting news about that Georgian Papers program Andrew just told us about. It's launched. You can now explore and read some of King George III's papers right from the comfort of home. I've included a link to the Georgian Papers and to that fascinating abdication document Andrew referred to in the show notes and in the show description. So if you happen to be out and about, you should be able to open your favorite podcast app and click on that link and explore the program right from your favorite app. Now, if the Enlightenment, Native American history, or New York history are topics that interest you, be sure to visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell and check out that new critical edition of Cadwalader Colden's History of the Five Indian Nations. For a limited time, Cornell University Press is offering you Colden's book, all of the other titles I've mentioned in the show, plus many more titles at a 30% discount just for being a Ben Franklin's World listener. So when you visit benfranklinsworld.com/Cornell, don't forget to use your special promo code of 09BFW. And no, you don't have to remember this code if you're out and about, because Cornell has helpfully placed that code right at the top of your special sales page. Finally, what do you think is a good way for us to view the American War for Independence? Should we view it as an American victory, a British defeat, or in some other more nuanced way? I'm curious about your thoughts, so send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.